Welcome to episode 54 of Tahrir Podcast, and the third in-person episode is December 8th, 2025, and I'm joined today in Washington, D.C. by my guest, Professor Killian Clarke, or I'm your guest, rather. So if you're watching, please make sure you're tuning in via YouTube so you can see both of us speak in person. Dr. Killian Clarke is an assistant professor in the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, affiliated with the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, CCAS. We'll be discussing in this episode Professor Killian's most recent book, Return of Tyranny, Why Counterrevolutions Emerge and Succeed, published by Cambridge University Press in 2025, last month. And the book offers one of the first systematic studies of counter-revolution, drawing on global data since 1900 and new evidence from Egypt's 2011 revolution. The book explains why counter-revolutions emerge and what enables them to succeed. It advances a movement-centric argument showing how the strategies revolutionary leaders adopt, both during their campaigns and after taking power, shape a regime's vulnerability. Violent, ideologically radical movements tend to build regimes that are hard to overturn, while democratic revolutions like Egypt's face greater risks, though they can still avert counter-revolution by preserving elite coalitions, maintaining broad support, and mobilizing the public when threatened. Finally, the book speaks to today's concerns about democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism, revealing how democratic experiments can be reversed and how autocrats and reactionaries are able to build mass support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. Support one of Egypt's remaining independent media platforms. Support Tahrir Podcast. This episode is supported by the Arab Political Science Network. So welcome on the podcast, Professor.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I've been following it for several years now, and I'll add to your plug to those listeners who are considering subscribing that this is a really valuable piece of media on Egypt's politics and one of the few independent pieces of media on Egyptian politics, and so it really is worth supporting. And I'm very honored to be featured.
Thank you for saying that. It's an honor to have you. And if you recall, we corresponded via email, I think 2 years ago, about your book project when it was still developing. And so it's really surreal to actually sit together in your office in person and talk about it. It's really a pleasure.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't write it fast.
That's fine. So let's start with the night. In July 2013. Why did you choose Egypt's counter-revolution as the way to open the book? And what, for you, makes Egypt a pragmatic case for understanding counter-revolutions more broadly?
Well, there is a sort of principled research design answer to your question. And then, as is always true with research, there's the real answer to your question. And so I'll start with the principled research design answer, which is that, Egypt's 2013 counter-revolution really is, the recent episode of counter-revolution. It's one of the paradigmatic cases recently, but also, frankly, over the last, century or so. And so any theory or book about counter-revolution that can't explain what happened in Egypt and can't, successfully evaluate the factors in Egypt's counter-revolution isn't really much good as a theory. So that's the principled reason. The real reason, which is more related to biography and how the book developed and unfolded, is that I was starting graduate school at Princeton a year after the 2013 counter-revolution. So I began in the fall of 2014. I had been working on Egypt in my prior work, in my master's degree, in my undergraduate degree. I had done written theses and articles about Egyptian politics, and particularly about protest and mobilization and revolution in Egypt. And, the 2013 counter-revolution was, for me and for virtually everyone who had been following and watching Egypt's revolution and in transition with hope, it was a catastrophe. It was a tragedy. And, so I wanted to understand what had happened. I wanted to make sense of it. I wanted to write a dissertation about the coup and the failure of the transition and the revolutionary experiment. And that set me on a course to write a book about counter-revolution, because there hadn't been very much written about counter-revolution up until that point. And so we didn't have much in the way of literature, theory, arguments, basic empirics to put Egypt's experience in context. And so that was the motivation for the book. That was the motivation for the dissertation. And Egypt in the book is the theory building case. It is the episode of counter-revolution from which the book and the theory and the more global part of the book emerges from. And then, the theory had to evolve and change. So it wasn't just a theory of Egypt's counter-revolution, but a general theory of counter-revolution. But the starting point always was Egypt's episode, and that's why I started the book with it.
Mm. And speaking of counter-revolution, to kind of lay some sort of basic ground to, so the audience, those that are not necessarily well-versed in these terms, can you maybe start by describing how you operationalize, how you go about defining counter-revolution, and why it matters to be strict with defining it, and then basically the flaws that can come with that?
Sure, yeah. Right, so I mean, counter-revolution is a term that's used in all kinds of different ways. It's used by scholars. It's used by, as in polemics. It's used by lay people. It's used by revolutionaries themselves, and it means different things in different contexts. And for social science research, we need good, clear concepts. We need to understand what the thing is that we're trying to explain. And so the first step for this project was I had to kind of put a stake in the sand and say, okay, well, what do I mean by counter-revolution, or how am I defining it in this book? And it's not the only way that it could be defined. But my definition is about the reversal of an initially successful revolution. So it's about counter-revolutionary restorations. That is to say, the restoration of a version of the old regime after an initially successful revolution. And when I say an initially successful revolution, what I mean is a mass movement, a popular movement that has successfully deposed an incumbent regime and dictator, and has started off the process of establishing a new regime. Now, that process hasn't necessarily been completed, but it's been initiated by the overthrow of the incumbent regime. And so in the book, I'm interested in explaining under what conditions do those fallen incumbents, do the agents of the old regime attempt and successfully manage to restore themselves in office.
Yeah, and I think the part about Egypt in particular and the trilemma argument was also fascinating, and we'll get to that later. But let's first lay even more ground to kind of ground it. And so when you mapped counter-revolutions globally since 1900, what surprised you the most about the patterns, and both how often counter-revolutions happen and how rarely they actually succeed?
Yeah, well, the end of your question really speaks to the puzzle that I found in the data when I started collecting it. And again, I mean, going back to the motivation of the project, when the coup in 2013 happened, as I said, there was very little in the way of theory or empirics with which to put it in context. One of the basic questions that I asked and others asked, and that we didn't have answers to, was how often has this happened? How frequent is it? How common is it for these revolutionary projects to be reversed? And we didn't have comparative data to make sense of it. So, is counter-revolution inevitable? Is it likely? Is it unlikely? We had no sense of the frequency with which this kind of thing occurred. And so the first step in the project was to go out and collect data on counter-revolution globally in order to put Egypt's experience in context. The data that I collected led to several interesting findings that I didn't expect, and that others who were advising my project also didn't expect. The first is that counter-revolutions are not an inevitable or automatic reaction to revolutionary success. This is a kind of conventional wisdom in the revolution scholarship that if you have a revolutionary movement seize power, a counter-revolution is kind of almost automatic. And, it's sort of, action reaction sort of dynamic. Empirically, that's not true. So I went out and I looked at all 123 incidences of successful revolution globally from 1900 to the present. This is using an existing data set that I was fortunate enough, my advisor at Princeton had collected this original data set. So it has all successful instances of revolution globally from the beginning of the 20th century. And I went out and I looked at each incident and I said, okay, did this revolutionary movement, once it seized power, was it confronted by a counter-revolution, an attempt at restoration? And roughly half of these revolutions saw counter-revolutions. So it's far from inevitable or even likely. Only about half of them see counter-revolutionary attempts. About 1 in 5 of these revolutions are reversed. So see the old regime return to power, or a version of the old regime return to power after they've attempted to install a new revolutionary government. So the statistic is about 20%. And that's, Egypt's outcome, right? So the experience that Egypt had in 2013 is an experience that roughly 1 in 5 revolutionary governments have experienced, which is not a particularly high proportion. Now, as the book explains, the proportions are slightly higher for certain types of revolutions, democratic revolutions, nonviolent revolutions, revolutions with more moderate goals. And those, are the characteristics that also define Egypt's revolution. But even there, the ratio is about 1 in 3. So it's not an extremely high ratio of successful counter-revolution. So this immediately raised questions about some of the conventional wisdom that was starting to emerge about Egypt's coup, which, were kind of along the lines of this revolutionary project could never have succeeded. It was always doomed to fail. The revolutionaries were so weak compared to the military. The military was always bound to seize power back. If you just look at the raw comparative data, if you just look at the statistics, already there are important questions raised about those sorts of conclusions.
Mm. And why do you think the strategies chosen by revolutionary leaders matter more for counter-revolutionary outcomes than things like economic performance, welfare strength, or social polarization?
Yeah, so that's one of the main findings of the book, is that, counter-revolution really is an outcome that can be avoided. It's easier to avoid for certain types of revolutionaries than others, but there's a path to avoiding counter-revolution or defeating counter-revolution for all revolutionary governments, I argue, no matter how strong the old regime is, and no matter how resource poor the new revolutionary government is. Part of the logic behind this is just to kind of a basic logical exercise of just thinking about the kind of situation that revolutionaries find themselves in when they first seize power. The theory in the book starts off from the premise that a successful revolution entails, by definition, that revolutionaries are kind of in the driver's seat, right? That they come to power with the wind in their sails. They have either seized power through force of arms, so they either have a rebel army at their back or a revolutionary army at their back. In the case of revolutions like Egypt, there's no armed force to support them, but they have mass support. They have the backing of society. They have tremendous social legitimacy. And importantly, they have the capacity to remobilize their base, to pour back into the streets, and to use that mobilizational power as leverage. And so when they first come to power, they have a power advantage over the old regime. And the trick for any revolutionary government is to retain that leverage as much as possible. And so, they may face a powerful old regime establishment, but you have to remember that that's an old regime establishment that has already been ousted once by the revolution, right? The revolution has already succeeded in the kind of initial contest of will. And so the key is for revolutionary governments to maintain that leverage and maintain that power advantage at all costs, which is why sort of logically, I don't put as much weight on the coercive strength or coercive power of the old regime, because again, that's a coercive establishment that has already been defeated in the first round of the contest.
Mm. But I think in the Egypt case, and I think we'll get to that later, there's a lot of still debate about whether the Muslim Brotherhood was even itself a revolutionary organization, or was it revolutionary, was it counter-revolutionary, given that they sided with the military. But I think when we get to the Egypt part, it'll be much better to kind of unfold.
Sure. And this is what I mean about the terms revolution and counter-revolution being used in different ways. Because that's right. People call the Muslim Brotherhood counter-revolutionary, and they were in certain ways, but not in the way that I'm defining it in the book.
Yeah. I think one of the ways in which I could subscribe to that line of thought is the context and the behavior. That was, of course, revolutionary. I think it is pretty clear they were battling the state and wanting to take over the state, basically. And you argue that radical, violent revolutions are actually harder to reverse than democratic, nonviolent ones. How do you explain that paradox, and what does it say about the long-term risks that come with choosing nonviolent, moderate strategies? And this argument was one of my first introductions to your book. I think it was published in an article 2 years ago. I think I was in North Carolina, and I studied that, and I wrote a little bit about it. And I think that was very sobering.
Yeah, it's one of the, I have to be careful when I talk about the book because in the zone, and when I present it, because sometimes I come off looking like a kind of, champion of violent revolution. So, the data is pretty clear, and the empirics are pretty clear. And I've written about this in the article you mentioned. I think it was the American Political Science Review article, Revolutionary Violence and Counterrevolution. The empirical pattern is quite clear, which is that if you are a revolutionary movement who seizes power through force of arms, the likelihood of you being ousted by a counter-revolution and seeing the old regime come back to power is virtually zero. There's only one episode in the data set of an armed revolution being ousted by counter-revolution. There's three. There's one leftist revolution and two ethno-nationalist revolutions. Those where that occurs, it only occurs because a foreign military power gets involved and helps the counter-revolutionaries succeed. So that's the only circumstance I found in which an armed revolutionary government is overthrown by a counter-revolution. And the logic is pretty straightforward. It's basically because there's a revolutionary army or a rebel army that has already proven itself on the battlefield through guerrilla warfare in seizing power. And that revolutionary army is then reconstituted as the army of the new state and serves as a shield for the new government and successfully puts down any counter-revolution challenge that emerges. So the violent path of revolution is the most successful when it comes to resisting counter-revolution. That being said, we also have to pay attention to the types of governments that armed revolution establish. And when you look at the types of governments that come to power through armed resistance, they are almost always autocratic. There's very few cases of successful armed rebellion establishing forking democracies, liberal regimes. Some of them do establish progressive regimes in the sense of leftist regimes, but they're often quite repressive and quite brutal in their own way. And so you often end up replacing one violent dictatorship with another violent dictatorship. And so that's why in the book, I spend a lot of time, I spend basically the whole second half of the book fleshing out and establishing a viable path to resisting counter-revolution for nonviolent revolutionaries who seize power without an army, without a rebel group, a rebel armed force behind them, and thinking through the strategies that they can embrace to resist counter-revolution and also establish a more open, liberal, inclusive type of regime. Now, the failure rate for those types of governments is higher. It's about 1 in 3, like I said, but that also means that 2 out of 3 of those governments do manage to either avoid counter-revolution entirely or defeat a counter-revolution once it's occurred. So that's a relatively high rate. And so part of the book is about fleshing out how revolutionaries can do that.
I know that you spoke about it. I was going to ask you a question about that, about how to grapple really with that. And so, the data is, you could argue that it's pretty bleak. So what advice would you give to people that believe in nonviolent resistance and how to kind of grapple with this dilemma?
I think it's just important to be very aware of trade-offs, right? And the costs and benefits of certain types of action. Again, the patterns are quite clear. If, as an activist or an opposition movement, you choose to embrace a strategy of armed resistance, the likelihood that your movement will end with some kind of a liberal or open or inclusive or democratic regime is very low. And so if that's the vision you have for your society and your polity, then going down the armed path is not a good strategy. Embracing nonviolence, embracing unarmed resistance is the way to bring about to build a broad coalition. There's a lot of research on this and why that's true. Herka Chenoweth and Maria Stephan have a very famous book on this topic. Nonviolence is a more effective way of bringing in different groups and types of people into a broad movement that can become the basis for a pluralistic and liberal regime. But breadth of coalition and diversity of coalition also has trade-offs and downsides. And so, movement leaders and activists and opposition figures have to be aware of those benefits and those downsides so that they can effectively try to manage them as best as possible.
Yeah, and I think this reminds me of the concept of empirical pluralism. I think it was a book chapter by Tahrir Massoud kind of explaining how he also used that term very well, that like knocking on the military barracks basically to undo at like bayonet point what you couldn't do through like the ballot box and kind of this whole idea. And now this takes us to Egypt. I think there's plenty to unpack in Egypt chapters, the 2 chapters in Egypt. And so you show that in the Egypt chapters, you show that the revolutionary camp initially had real leverage over the generals, SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, throughout the threat of renewed mass mobilization and foreign backing. But then they squandered that advantage. And you trace how coalition ruptures and U.S. ambivalence opened the door for the military. So if we zoom in on Egypt after 2011, where exactly did the revolutionary camp lose its leverage over the military? And was there a particular set of decisions or moments in what respect that you think this is where the counter-revolution became possible? Because for me, when I think about it personally, I think about, for example, the first founding election, the first parliamentary election we had, and that was in November 2011. And that was during the Mohammed Mahmoud clashes, and that was almost described as like a second wave of the Egyptian revolution. And how it started, of course, is that there were families of the martyrs that were killed during the revolution. They were having a sit-in in Tahrir Square, and the military attacked them and I think killed multiple people. So there was almost a second wave of revolt against the military. They wanted the military to go back. Meanwhile, there were parliamentary elections, and that was the election that the Islamists in general dominated. And so I think this is also very important in kind of shaping this particular period.
I agree. I definitely agree. I mean, a couple of responses to the question and what you just said. First of all, yes, those protests in late 2011 are, I think they are well described as a kind of second revolution, and they actually get it. They're very important for my theory and my argument because they get it exactly what I mean when I say, even unarmed revolutionaries, even nonviolent revolutionaries who come to power maintain leverage over the old regime after they first seize power. And the leverage that they have is through protest. They have the ability to go back out into the street in numbers and push their revolutionary agenda and keep the old regime in check through protest and through mass mobilization. That's the one thing that they have and the one point of leverage that they have. And you see that playing out at the end of 2011, right? With the Maspero protests, with the Mohammed Mahmoud protests. There were also a number of protests in 2012 before the elections when SCAF, it looked like SCAF was going to maybe start interfering in the elections. So those are generative episodes for me theoretically, because I think they show that this revolutionary movement had the capacity to go back out to the street in number, both the Islamist side and the secularist side, join forces in the street again against the military, which they recognize as their shared enemy. Now, you asked when they started to lose this leverage, and you also asked when counter-revolution started to feel inevitable. I think those are two different questions. The process of losing leverage over the military happened gradually. And I think there are a number of critical junctures during the transition where, had things gone differently, that revolutionary leverage could have been preserved. And I make the case in the chapter, and I think this is where I disagree with some other very, very competent and strong Egypt scholars who've analyzed this period, I think that the potential to regain this leverage existed much later than others have argued. I don't think that counter-revolution became inevitable. I don't even really like using the term inevitable. I don't think it became highly likely until the spring of 2013, or maybe even early summer, maybe even as late as June.
With the massacre?
You mean the Rabaa massacre? Well, Rabaa was in August.
Yeah.
No, by the time the coup happens, that's the counter-revolution. So I'm talking about earlier than that. But I think that there was a possibility to mend fences and regain some of this initial revolutionary unity pretty late into the process, as late as possibly April or May 2013. But some key moments, some key really important points when this leverage started to dissipate. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood made two very poor choices, or strategic choices, vis-a-vis the elections. The first is that they dominated parliamentary elections in a way that they promised they wouldn't. And the second is that they chose to nominate a presidential candidate, also breaking a promise that they made early in the transition. And this really created a schism, and it bred a lot of distrust between what was clearly the most powerful political force on the ground, other than the military, and the rest of the revolutionary coalition. Now, I don't think that was that had to be the end of things. I think that fences could have been mended. And I talk in the book about a really important moment during and around the second round of the presidential elections, when Morsi was running against Shafik. There was a meeting at the Fairmont Hotel where basically all of the main secularist political leaders attended this meeting, and they kind of had a rapprochement with Morsi. This was actually after the second round of voting had ended, but before the results had been announced. Excuse me. And there was a lot of actually goodwill that came out of that meeting. And I spoke to members of both sides who attended that meeting, and there was a lot of goodwill that was built there. And I think Morsi had a real opportunity to build on that goodwill, to build an inclusive presidential administration that would have included members of the secularist political opposition in meaningful positions. And when he didn't do that in, the summer of 2012, getting into September of 2012, that really started to push the two sides apart, right? And then the moment where the schism really opened up was with the presidential declaration in November and Ittihadiyya clashes. That was really where things broke apart. Again, I think that things could have been mended after the fact. That's really the key decisive turning point is that presidential declaration in November and the subsequent clashes that occurred, because at that point you have the formation of the National Salvation Front on the secular side, the emergence of a real opposition movement to Morsi. I show this with the protest data that I collected, that you start to see calls for Morsi's resignation. You'd start to see a lot more anti-Morsi protests. And that was a key inflection moment. But up until that point, I think there were actually a lot of off-ramps where this coalition could have come back together and, gotten back to the kind of place that they were at the end of 2011, the beginning of 2012, where they saw that their shared enemy was the military, and that was the kind of basis for their unity.
Why do you think perhaps this is not very related, but why do you think the Muslim Brotherhood fell in the trap of siding with the military against the revolutionaries, basically?
Well, I don't think they always sided with the military. I think they had a complicated relationship with the military. It kind of waxed and waned, to be honest. They had as far as I could tell, an informal agreement with the military. I didn't ever uncover evidence that there was any formal agreement, but I'm sure that they had spoken. There was something of an informal agreement that came about at the end of 2011, where the military sort of recognized that they needed a civilian partner. And because the Muslim Brotherhood was the most powerful, civilian player on the ground, they saw that they had a kind of alignment of interests in, potentially getting politics out of the street and moving quickly to the establishment of new political institutions. But that was one moment of alignment. But then there was a tremendous amount of hostility leading up to the presidential elections because the military basically realized that they had given the Muslim Brotherhood, for the Muslim Brotherhood was accruing too much power, right? And so then there were all these kind of desperate efforts by the military to, first of all, they canceled parliament. And there's evidence that they tried to put their thumb on the presidential elections. They obviously disqualified the Muslim Brotherhood's main candidate, Khairez al-Shater. So there were all these ways in which they tried to undermine the Muslim Brotherhood's momentum during that period. So that was not a period of comedy between those two forces. Fast forward to Morsi's administration. Morsi's administration, his team basically took the strategy of giving the military all that they wanted in an effort to try to buy them off and keep them at bay, right? So this is this gets into the trilemma part of the argument that you alluded to in the trilemma, a piece of the theory in the book, which is that he basically prioritized the wrong set of actors in thinking about these sort of different groups that he could have tried to work with. It's not that he had goodwill towards the military or that he trusted them per se, but he thought that he could give them what they wanted, sufficient enough that he could kind of keep them at bay, right? He thought he could carve out a set of prerogatives and rights for them, which is why they wrote the Constitution in the way that they did, even though there were very few military representatives in the Constitution drafting committee. They basically gave the military everything they wanted. They gave them control over their budget. They gave them control over national security issues. And Morsi and his team thought that if they did that, the military would leave them alone to run the country as they saw fit in all the other realms of governance. And that was just a fundamental miscalculation, right? That the idea that they could buy them off, that they could appease them, and that the military, the moment that it seemed the Muslim Brotherhood and the Morsi government was weak, that the military wouldn't seize the opportunity to take back power. That was the Morsi administration's fundamental miscalculation.
But I think the part about when people say that they had a deal, obviously it was less likely that it was something formal or something in ink. But I think for me, when I think about it, I think about the parliamentary elections, for example, that they had some sort of agreement that you will legitimize these elections and you will run these elections, in contrast to the revolutionaries who did boycott it, of course, given the Mohammed Mahmoud sort of situation. But now that he spoke about the post-revolutionary trilemma they described, could he maybe go into a little bit, make that framework a little bit clearer?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and this is a framework that emerged directly from the study of the Egypt case. But interestingly, when I started reading about other incidences of revolution and counter-revolution, other episodes of successful counter-revolution, I saw this logic playing out in a lot of other cases, which is why I had it made it the centerpiece of the theory. It's basically, the book argues that all revolutionary governments face what I call a trilemma, right? I use the term trilemma because it implies trade-offs. It implies that you have to make hard decisions and choose between competing imperatives and priorities. And in the trilemma, there's basically three sets of actors that you have to think about and worry about when you come to power. And this is particularly relevant and acute for these unarmed revolutionary governments, right? If you have arms, if you're one of these violent revolutions, you don't have to worry as much about this because you have coercive resources. You have the ability to rule through violence. Unarmed revolutionaries don't have that luxury. So they come to power and they have to kind of balance between these three different groups. The first are the lingering remnants of the old regime. So in the Egypt case, this is SCAF, this is the military, to some extent other elements of the deep state, but really the military is the main force. And that's true in other cases as well. So that's the first group. The second piece is that you have to think about your revolutionary coalition and the elite members of your revolutionary coalition who, you might want to try to keep including your government, but maybe don't have to, right? So every time you see one of these revolutionary governments emerge, the government that takes power is narrower, right, than the revolutionary coalition that ousted the incumbent that led to the fall of the regime, right? And this is exactly what happened in Egypt. You have elections, the Muslim Brotherhood seizes power. The Muslim Brotherhood represented only one part of the original revolutionary coalition. And there were large factions of that coalition that were not represented in their first the parliament and then the Morsi governance. So the second group you have to think about is your revolutionary allies, right? And then the third group you have to think about are what I call sort of social forces or popular forces in society. So these are societal groups, organized labor, social movements, not political movements, but social movements. So, in Egypt, this is the independent workers movement, and these are various local trade union groups, various ultras organizations, different types of popular forces in society who have demands and have grievances, either from before the revolution or that emerged during the revolution. And they want those demands to be met by the new government. They have expectations that were unleashed by the revolution, and they want those expectations to be fulfilled. And it's very difficult for new governments to meet all of these demands. They're usually underwater, they're usually overwhelmed, they're trying to deal with all of these challenging governance issues simultaneously. And so it's sometimes difficult to meet all these demands, but the point is you have to try, right? When you have to show these popular forces, these groups in society, that you're making a good faith effort to try to make the revolution's promises come true. And the reason I call it a trilemma is that I argue that most of these unarmed revolutionary governments don't have the ability to do all three of these things. They don't have the ability to appease the agents of the old regime, satisfy their elite allies in the revolutionary coalition, and also respond to the grievances emerging from society. They have to choose between those. And in the book, I argue that there's a clear best strategy, which is you prioritize the revolution, you prioritize your elite allies, and you prioritize those popular forces in society, because if a counter-revolution is attempted, you need to have the ability to remobilize the base of revolution. You have to be able to go back into the streets and protest, because that's all you have. And that's how you stop these coups, these counter-revolutionary coups, from succeeding. And I actually found in the research a number of historical episodes from other countries, other time periods, but similar contexts, where this happens, where the revolutionary coalition gets remobilized in the face of the counter-revolutionary coup, and the coup is reversed or is stopped, right? Even with a very powerful military establishment. So this happens in Venezuela after the 1958 revolution. It happens in Bolivia after the 1982 popular uprising. It happens in Indonesia in the People Power uprising. It happens in Burkina Faso after the 2014 uprising. So there are precedents for this, of this revolutionary kind of remobilization, halting counter-revolutions when they're attempted. And this is the kind of counterfactual history, the counterfactual outcome that I think was possible in Egypt had different decisions been made, right? And I think you see a little bit of that logic play out in those episodes at the end of 2011 that we were talking about, where the base of the revolution gets remobilized and the military and the SCAF do actually take a step back. They actually are forced to backtrack on these very unpopular policies and tracks that they're on.
But then you also have, after that, in 2013, you have the quote people basically mobilize against the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, it's not as simple as that. You had the UAE funding and you had the Saudis putting a lot of money in it. So you could also make the argument that part of it was artificial, but at the same time, you can also make the argument that the majority did not want this to continue going on, and so they were against it. So at a certain point, who is the party really that is it just the people, quote? Like, how do you kind of envision that or place it within the argument?
Yeah, so that's basically, so you're exactly right. And I actually pushed back quite hard on this idea that it's a kind of Tamarud and the popular base of 2013. The 2013 coup was a fake movement or an AstroTurk movement. I think that's been actually overstated. Obviously there was some foreign meddling, and they did receive money from abroad, but the popular base of that movement was quite legitimate and quite real. There were genuinely, hundreds of thousands and millions of people out in the street protesting against the Brotherhood and in favor of, at least tacitly in favor of a military coup. So how did we get to that point, and how does that relate to the trilemma? It's a great question. Basically, my argument is that if and when these unarmed revolutionary governments choose the other strategy, the strategy that I don't advocate for, which is, what happened with the Brotherhood, kowtowing or cozying up to the old regime and alienating their elite allies in the revolutionary coalition and the popular base of the revolution. If that happens, then you're very susceptible to those different groups turning on you, right? And coming to the conclusion that the devil they know is better than the devil they don't, right? Which is essentially what happened in Egypt. The, secularists in the coalition and these popular forces in society decided that they were going to be happier with a return to military rule when they were going to be with the continued rule of this one faction within the revolutionary coalition. And they defected and they decided to mobilize against that new government. They decided to return to the practices of revolution, but instead use those practices against the government that they had helped to create. And in doing so, they created the mass base for the counter-revolution. And again, if we look comparatively, because again, this is part of what I'm booking the book will teach us about this case, because a lot of what I'm saying is not entirely new. Other people have said this about Egypt. But what I find when we look globally is this is common. And this is what happens in a lot of other cases. You actually have a mass movement in support of counter-revolutionary restoration. And that mass movement is often comprised of people who were part of the original revolution, right? Who've grown disaffected, who've grown disillusioned, who decided that they're better off with the old regime than they are with this new unknown regime that they brought to power. And so you see this in Thailand in 1973, right? You see this in Hungary in 1919. You see this in a whole bunch of other cases in Sudan in 1985, where revolutionaries, essentially become counter-revolutionaries.
Mm. Yeah, and there's actually a saying that was pretty common back then. It says, goes, جحيم العسكر ولا جنة الإخوان. I mean, hell under the military, over heaven under the brotherhood.
This whole period, it's all about trade-offs, right? What was it? They also said in the second round of the presidential election, everyone was talking about choosing between cholera and plague. Because they had to choose between Shafiq and Morsi, right? I mean, so, the number of phrases like this that emerged during this transition are too many to count.
Yeah, and the slogans were...
Yeah.
And so you also hand-coded the protest, the data set of roughly 7,500 events in the last 18 months before the coup. And you show how ongoing social and labor grievances were gradually channeled into anti-Morsi, pro-stability mobilization. So what did your protest data reveal about how everyday Egyptians moved from supporting the revolution to effectively marching for its reversal? I think we covered that, but maybe there's something we didn't cover.
Yeah, I mean, I could just kind of go over the findings from that chapter. So yeah, basically the protest data is it's an event data set, what we call in political science an event data set, which means it's basically an inventory of all the protests that took place between January 1st, 2012 to July 3rd, 2013. So it covers the final 6 months of staff rule and then the full Morsi year, essentially. And it's all the protests that occurred in Egypt as documented by this one newspaper, El Masra al-Yawm, which is at the time, not anymore, but at the time was a fairly independent newspaper with broad national coverage. That does report on a lot of protests. So I and a team of research assistants basically collected all of the protests. There are about 7,500 total. And I used that protest data to kind of trace the arc of mobilization against Morsi and the emergence of this popular movement that we were just talking about, that, kind of broke out in roughly in November of 2012 and then accelerated in the winter and spring of 2013. The main finding from the analysis is that basically there were two types of anti-Morsi kind of counter-revolutionary protests. The first is there were what I call, protests by committed counter-revolutionists. So these are people who probably were rooting for a counter-revolution all along, who never wanted Mubarak's regime to fall, who never supported the revolution, who always preferred military rule. I measure the location of these people with the vote share for Ahmed Shafiq in the first round of the presidential elections. Basically, I show that in places where support for Shafiq was stronger, one of the governorates These would be relevant for people who know Egypt well, as Menufia, right, which is kind of known as a bit of a stronghold for the NDP and the Mubarak regime. So Shafiq support is very high in Menufia. And what I show is that, anti-Morsi protesting, counter-revolutionary protesting was also higher in these districts with strong Shafiq support. So that's one social base for the mass movement. But the other social base, and the more interesting one and more relevant one for this story, is that basically protest emerged in places where during the SCAF period, you had seen more generalized discontent, right? Social and labor and economic protesting and mobilization around all kinds of societal and economic grievances. Places where there had been a lot of this prior mobilization were also places where anti-Morsi protesting picked up and actually began earlier on in the process. And so the logic or the kind of conclusion that I infer from this is that there was this sort of generalized societal discontent that at a certain point during Morsi's administration came to be redirected and focused on the president, the kind of new anti-incumbent energy that emerged. And this is actually the more relevant social mass base for the counter-revolution that occur. These are kind of these mini societal movements that were taking place all over the country that ended up being channeled and harnessed by the counter-revolution, by the Tahrir movement, and focus on the president and military restoration.
So basically, if you would describe how that happened or why counter-revolution ultimately took over, really, how do you describe that in one sentence that would kind of encompass all of it?
It's hard to encompass it in one sentence. I mean, the mechanisms through which this happened, I think, are multiple. Yeah. I mean, one is that there was just a kind of new general anti-incumbent energy, right, where people just blamed the president, right? People just blamed Morsi for all kinds of problems because he was the president, right? I think the Muslim Brotherhood made it worse by ignoring a lot of societal issues. This gets back to the trilemma logic, where they kind of ignored a lot of these popular challenges that were emerging, these societal grievances. I think, frankly, a lot of it also had to do with counter-revolutionaries cynically taking advantage of this stuff, right? So, I mean, if you look at the media environment in 2013, in spring of 2013, media in Egypt was largely dominated by Fadul and secularist outlets, right? A lot of them were affiliated with either old regime or liberal kind of political parties and movements. They were blaming everything on Morsi, right? So there was a very strong effort by certain parts of the Egyptian media to kind of tie all of these problems that Egypt was experiencing to the president. And I think that contributed a bit. And I think there was also a fair amount of secularist social movements on the ground. People like the 6th of April movement, Hamdi Sabahi's movement, Mohammed al-Baradei's movement, the National Salvation Front. They were organizing people on the ground, and they were trying to encourage people to protest, and they were trying to convince people that the problems they were facing were the Morsi administration's fault. So I think it's a combination of these different things that led to this kind of new counter-revolutionary momentum. But I have in the book some interesting examples of this. I'll just mention one of them that is, I would say it's funny. All of this story is tragic, but it is kind of funny. So I think it was in April 2013 in Asaf University. There was an incident of food poisoning in the cafeteria. A bunch of students got food poisoning. And because, this was the post-revolutionary time, what do you do when something like this happens? You start protesting. So the first day after the food poisoning incident, they all go out into the courtyard at the university, and they start protesting against the administration, the Hazar administration, because of course it's their fault. There's a food poisoning incident in the cafeteria. 3 days later, there's another protest, and all of a sudden they're blaming it on the Morsi administration, and they're blaming it on Morsi. And then 5 days after that, there's another protest, and they're calling for Morsi's resignation. And it's the highly, local parochial issue of a food poisoning in a cafeteria at a university. But all of a sudden, this becomes channeled into this broader movement, and this becomes a kind of anti-Morsi protest. So this is kind of just one micro example of what was happening all over the country. It's kind of key.
And you compare Egypt with other trajectories like Tunisia and Libya and cases like Cuba, Venezuela, Thailand, like we spoke about some of them. And it basically shows you how counter-revolutions can fail, succeed, or results vary, basically. So when you step away from Egypt and look at cases like Tunisia, Cuba, Venezuela, for example, what are the most important lessons that that comparing them gives us? And particularly, maybe this is not relevant, but I want to hear your thoughts on Tunisia, given that how it happened, how basically their democracy backslided. I'm not really sure how to categorize that or how that happened really. So I'm curious if you also have any thoughts on that in particular.
Yeah, well, I'll answer the general question, then I'll talk about Tunisia. I mean, the main thing that the comparisons give, the final chapter that you're referring to, the final empirical chapter that you're referring to with the question is number 7. There's 6 shadow cases in that chapter. Part of the logic of that chapter is to kind of show these different counter-revolutionary pathways, to bring things back to the theory. So I have some of these armed revolutions in that chapter because that's an important part of the theory, part of the story of why counter-revolutions do or do not occur. I think for the Egypt case, the most interesting piece of that chapter is the Venezuela shadow case, because the Venezuela shadow case, as I briefly referred to, is the one where we see essentially the counterfactual scenario that I'm suggesting was possible in Egypt. We see it playing out in the Venezuelan revolution, where you have an unarmed revolution, you have a military dictatorship, you have a democratic government, structure of the coalition, but it's a lot like Egypt for one political party that's stronger. It's a social democratic party, not an Islamist one, but it's, the more powerful of the parties. There's several smaller parties that disagree with the stronger party ideologically. Crucially, in this case, the Social Democrat Party decides to form a pact with the other political parties, even though they're ideological rivals. And they form this inclusive pactive government because they recognize that this is how you have to create leverage against the military. This is how you preserve and protect the new democracy. And the military in this kind of case does try to seize back power. There are actually 6 military coups in Venezuela, counter-revolutionary coups. It's the case in the David side with the most attempted counter-revolutions. But they all fail. And the first one, which is the most threatening, is defeated because the revolution goes back into the streets, right? These political parties, they remobilize their followers. They also have not lost the social base of the revolution. So the labor movements and whatnot also remobilize. And they defeat this coup. They force the military back into the barracks. So that case is kind of one piece of evidence that I use to argue that what I'm proposing was possible in Egypt is not just kind of fiction and just kind of, counterfactual theorizing. It's actually grounded in a concrete disposal episode. And there are several others that I point to. I don't analyze this much, but I point to this as well. On Tunisia, I actually had to rewrite that part of the chapter because, of course, Tunisia's trajectory or its kind of, scoring in my outcomes changed while I was writing the book because of the Kais Saied power grab in 2021. I actually don't think that qualifies as counter-revolution, at least not by the definition that I've laid out. You could probably make the case it qualifies in a broader sense, but it doesn't qualify as the old regime returning to power, or a version of the old regime returning to power. Kais Saied was not a member of the old regime. He was not an important player in, Ben Ali's political party or in his government or in his political establishment. So even though he is an autocrat, he's certainly an autocrat. He's not from that original ruling coalition. And I actually think the logic by which he sees power is very different from what happened in Egypt and most of these counter-revolutions that I'm analyzing. Kais Saied sees power because he took advantage of actually the issues that often come about when you do the sorts of things that I'm proposing you should do to resist counter-revolution. What do I mean by that? The strategy for resisting counter-revolution is to form in one of these pacts that I was just talking about in Venezuela. You want to make friends with your enemies. You want to create a broad coalition that presents a bulwark, a shield against potential counter-revolutionary interventions. This is exactly what happened in Tunisia. Tunisians were actually lauded for having a much more inclusionary type of political transition. For Egypt, they managed to put their differences aside. They formed a troika government, which survived a kind of counter-revolutionary scare in the summer of 2013. After the 2014 elections, you saw two political rivals come together to form a broad inclusive government. This was the Nahda Party and its rivals from the old regime. They formed a kind of inclusive political government. And Kais Saied essentially took advantage of the disillusionment in Tunisian society that emerged with what Tunisia saw a lack of political choice. So actually, Egypt and Tunisia, to me, spell out the perils of these periods and what happens if you go too far on either extreme, right? Because you can form one of these broad pacts that helps to protect your government from the old regime, but if that pact is too collusive and if there's not enough competition, you create the possibility for outsiders, populist outsiders, to come in and say, look, this political system is broken. It's not doing anything for you. I'm going to save the day. And that's exactly what Kais Saied did. And you actually also see this in some of these success cases that I talked about, where you have these collusive power sharing arrangements formed after these revolutions break out. They resist counter-revolution, but then they lead to these poor quality democracies where you have a lot of issues of participation, representation, and competition.
And very briefly, you show that counter-revolutions declined for much of the 20th century, and that started creeping back in the last decade. What's driving this recent uptick, and how does it fit into the broader story of democratic backsliding and authoritarian revival today?
So the short answer to your question is that it's basically about changing geopolitics. We haven't actually talked a lot about the international piece of the story. The theory is mostly about domestic politics, and that is where most of the kind of explanatory power, I think, is. Most of sort of what explains when counter-revolutions occur or not is about what's happening domestically. But international actors do play a role. And they can, and I say in the book, they can basically kind of tip things one way or the other when they're on the margin, right? They can sort of put their thumb on the scales and make it harder or easier for counter-revolutionaries or revolutionaries to succeed. And basically what I think we're seeing in the data, we see a clear uptick in counter-revolution over the last 5 years. Now, it's a small uptick. The data is preliminary, hits small numbers. But I do believe that if we were to extend the data to the present day, that uptick would continue, because we've seen several episodes of counter-revolution that are not included in the data set that would be included if we were to extend the data. So Sudan, for example, is a recent counter-revolution that's not in the data set that would make Burkina Faso has experienced counter-revolution. That would also be included. One could argue that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a kind of counter-revolution after the Euromaidan revolution. So we're seeing an uptick of counter-revolution over the last decade or a decade and a half. And I basically think it has to do with changing geopolitics and the rise and emergence of a set of geopolitical hackers who are strongly in favor of counter-revolution and antagonistic to certainly democratic revolutions or liberal revolutions. So those actors include Russia, they include Saudi Arabia, and then the United Arab Emirates. And I think what you're seeing is that as the United States retrenches, and even though the United States has, for much of 20th century history, was a very counter-revolutionary player in the world, since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has actually taken a more ambivalent position, and in some regions has actually been a supporter of democratic revolution because it's seen those revolutions as being in its interests. And as the United States has retrenched and has stopped being as involved in global affairs and has ceded that power to Russia, Saudi Arabia, and UAE and China and other actors, these global forces have taken on a more muscular role in supporting counter-revolutionaries in various parts of the world. If you look at the cases of counter-revolution since 2010, Egypt, Yemen, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Ukraine, these are all incidences where these global forces, these global actors have been involved, right? These three actors that I mentioned, Russia, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. That's the common denominator across all these places. And so I think that is part of what's going on. And I think that also, getting back to your question, ties into what we're seeing globally of this sort of authoritarian resurgence worldwide. I think, there's lots of people working on this. There's also theories for this, but certainly one of the reasons for this is the rise of these very aggressive kind of anti-democratic, pro-counter-revolution geopolitical powers.
I feel that. And lastly, before you wrap out, the book is scholarly and data heavy, but it clearly speaks to people who care about resisting authoritarianism now, whether in Egypt, the wider Middle East, or even in established democracies facing reactionary pushers. So if you were talking directly to activists or citizens in a country that has just gone through a democratic uprising, what practical lessons would you want them to take from your book, Return Tyranny, about how to guard the revolution against the future counter-revolution?
I think the one, most obvious takeaway is, remember who your true enemies are. I think this is where Egyptians lost their way. They forgot that, and they said this, and they knew this in 2011. We're united against the military, our enemies of the military. They forgot this at some point during the transition. They forgot who their true enemies are, and they got caught up in their differences, their antagonisms towards each other, and they forgot that the force that they really needed to worry about was the military. That was who they made their revolution against. And I think the revolutionaries in the future in Egypt, I hope in Egypt and in the Arab world and anywhere else, should remember that your number one enemy is the old regime, right? And even though you may have a lot of differences and then maybe a lot of bad blood and maybe a lot of disagreements with, other members of this broad revolutionary coalition, these are your friends, these are your allies. Even though you may not agree with them, you can set aside your differences. You can work those out down the line to the political process that's being set up. But your number one enemy is the military and the old regime. And you need to design your entire transition and your entire approach to politics around that conclusion and that insight. And I think this is where Egyptian revolutionaries lost their way. I think it's where a lot of other revolutionaries during the Arab Spring lost their way. And it's something that I hope people will read the book and take away from it as a kind of clear learning for future revolutionary episodes.
No problem. Any closing remarks?
No, this has been a lot of fun. It's you're an expert in Egyptian politics far more than I am. So, you've been charitable in allowing me to go on and on about my insights on this period. But, I hope it's resonated with what you know about this very, very complex episode of Egyptian politics.
I think it was extremely valuable. And even when it comes to counter-revolution in general, not just Egypt or the Middle East, I think with the data itself, and I think much of the data is available on your website, right?
It is, or it will be. The data will be made public this month.
Oh, nice. Perfect. So to fellow listeners, you can check in the episode's description, you'll find a link to the book and you'll find a link to Professor Killian's website. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. This was a real pleasure.
Of course, likewise.
بيرضع بزيت ديمقراطية النسر ختم لي بهجرة غير شرعية صور بتوع على الهيكل الموحد سرح وزارة الملايكة والسجاسي يا عيني على السجاسي. سيداتي أنساتي سادتي أعزائي المجنونة صدق على حب القاضي الكمينة بيحلل قبول للتعاطي الملك